Should I test? Yes, it works.
Yes. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our journée d'études on the Renaissance of Counterpoint. It's a pleasure to present Catherine Motus, who needs maybe no presentation, but she has played trombone in the most important Baroque orchestras, Amsterdam, Freiburg, and lots of ensembles. And she teaches trombone in Basel since 2018. Yes. Yeah, and she has been dealing with contrappunto alla mente since a long time as well, giving workshops and researching here and there. And we will have some insight into very fundamental aspects of navigating through the intervals. Happy to hear that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a real delight to be here. Like Philippe Canguilhem said yesterday, surrounded by colleagues who already understand quite a lot. And it's really great actually to follow on his talk, because he opened up a lot of questions about how do we teach counterpoint and the problem of the lack of methodology in a lot of counterpoint sources. And he mentioned something that Anna Maria Busseberger, who he also cited, mentioned, I think, 20 years ago in her book on memory, longer now actually, that there is a lot of pedagogical methodology in the presentation of diminutions treatises. And so I'm going to talk about that and talk about whether or not we can use this methodology to try to have a more structured approach to teaching counterpoint. And when I say orienteering skills, I mean especially the art of not getting lost while you're singing contrappunto alla mente. But I'm talking about other things as well, putting our little intervals into context and our commonplaces also into context. So, and I teach diminution probably a bit more than I teach contrappunto alla mente. As David mentioned, I teach a lot of workshops, also sometimes at the Schola, but on diminution I'm really teaching on a regular basis to my trombone students there, and sometimes to students of other instruments. And as a trombone teacher especially, I'm very interested also in how you teach to non-singers, to people who will be asked to play counterpoint as well as sing counterpoint, and how to teach to people who don't have the transferable skills like keyboard players that make it, I think, easier, and to people without perfect pitch also. So let's get started. Counterpoint and diminution pedagogy all have similar requirements. They all require that we assemble building blocks, a vocabulary of figures, and I'll explain exactly what I mean a little bit more soon. And then it requires that we learn orientation, how to put these blocks in context, and especially how we can navigate through them without getting lost. How can we build larger structures and always keep track of where we are? And then the last one, which I'm not really going to talk about today, but it would be wrong to leave it out, is judizio. How do we make something that actually sounds nice, that reinforces the affect of our text, that follows with period aesthetics, varietas and copia and all these nice things, and that follow rules like staying in range. I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but mainly I'm going to focus on what the building blocks are and how we orient ourselves between them. So the building blocks of orientation, of diminution, are, I would say they're the smallest figures, and the smallest figures are usually presented as 4-note figures. Sometimes you have a minimum and 2 quarter notes as well, but here are the 4-note figures at the beginning of the treatise by Giovanni Spadi. These are clearly meant to be memorized, but they have a little bit the problem of counterpoint treatises in that they give you something, an example of something once, and how are you going to then practice this for the hours and hours that you need to practice it? Well, Rognoni, the 2 Rognonis, Riccardo and his son Francesco, they give a more obvious way to practice because they arrange their building blocks into scales. They often present them with 2 different clefs, so that we can present them at different transpositions. So they're really giving a kind of exercise book. The treatise that I'm going to focus the most on today is Dalla Casa, because I think he has the most pedagogical approach and the most the approach that we can transfer onto counterpoint pedagogy the most easily. He also gives us 4-note patterns. He actually starts right off the bat with 8-note patterns, and on the second page he goes back to 4 notes. But he is very methodological about going from sorting his treatise according to different note values. And here he's actually only giving us one figure for every melodic motion, so going up a step, but then he's putting it into a scale so that students can practice. And he's sort of saving space and also telling us how to articulate on our wind instruments. He begins the treatise that way, understanding that without facility on your wind instrument, it's not time to start learning diminution again. And then halfway through the second page, he's given us all of the articulations that we need, and he keeps going on with his examples, leaving the articulations aside. So you can ignore them for now. They're, as a wind player, they're very important, of course. And then, so he gives us these building blocks and a way to practice them, and then soon he's going to chain them together. But what is the analog basic building block of counterpoint? And Cerrone answers that. He says, just as we only need 22 letters to make thousands of orations, we only need 22 intervals to make all music. So he suggests that just like letters are the building blocks of orations, intervals, so I think he means these vertical intervals, are the building blocks for counterpoint. And of course, we learned from, we had a few examples discussed by Philippe yesterday, Tinctoris, who gives over 700 different examples of all the ways to move from one interval to the next, and he's very exhaustive. And then there are other similar treatises, Vicentino, showing how to get to and from a minor sixth, and even Artusi, how to move between perfect and imperfect intervals. So with different levels of specificity, we have these tables of intervals, either in progressions of 2 or of 3. We suffer, though, we don't have, in that they're always presented in these small progressions. And when I got together with some friends to practice Tinctoris, we went through the first chapter and said, okay, how to get from a unison to a third. Great. So we went from a unison and then to a third, and then we didn't have anywhere to go, because how to go from a third to anywhere else, that was like 4 chapters away. So so I said, well, this is not going to do. So I have invented a methodology which I have tried on groups from the most amateur to the most advanced, and I have to say I've been using it for, I guess, 11 years now or so, and it really works quite well to get people started. And this is just alternating, giving them basic intervals, organized like Dalla Casa's intervals, in that they're organized in categories. So here we start with intervals related by 1 step, moving between fifths and sixths only. And the students then alternate fifths and sixths, and that's all that they do for one counterpoint exercise. And as far as I know, there's nothing like that in the historical literature, but for me, this was a way to be able to teach it with whole phrases at one time. Martin, I already sent the students from 2 days ago the whole workbook, so in case you're writing down. And then we move on to intervals related by a third or by 2 steps. If you're starting to think about the melodic relationship, it can be more useful to think, okay, there's 2 steps have to happen, either both in one voice and the other voice stays put, or 1 step in one direction, 1 step in the other direction. And honestly, once you can do all of these interval combinations related by step, you can sing on any cantus firmus already. You just have to fill in all the leaps with steps. So it's kind of astonishing. And with a beginner group, you can also If they're really beginners, you can double the cantus firmus in tenths. And if there are a few clever people around, you can say, well, I'll start on the sixth above and you start on the fifth below, and we follow these rules exactly. And you'll have the counterpoint that's moving in tenths. And the nice thing about this approach to counterpoint is that you also have the advantage that there's only ever one solution to a problem, which means that it doesn't matter how big the group is, it's not for one-on-one practice. It can be me and 40 students, and because there's only one solution to every puzzle, I can sing the cantus firmus and everybody else can sing the counterpoint. And you'll know if you're wrong because the people around you will be singing something else, assuming that most of them are at the level. This is great for group practice. Of course, I did wind up making recordings of the cantus firmuses for my entire workbook so that students could practice alone. And for existing counterpoint, we have now amazing websites like contrappunto.ch, which I saw has been vastly expanded in the last few years. So there are ways to practice with a cantus firmus on your own. One way that I've also found really useful is to just take Bacinium. If I'm feeling really hardcore, I do it in facsimile, but most of the time I take it with a score. And just looking at the melodic motions, I work out the vertical intervals just to train my brain in, okay, I see, I know that I'm starting on a tenth, and I see a leap down a third, so I'm on a 12th, and then that must be a tenth, so that must be a third, so that must be another third, and that must be a unison, and that must be another third, and then, a leap of fourth up and a third down, that must be an octave, and then, I've gotten up a step, that must be a seventh. So I'm just looking at the melodic motions, and I'm figuring out the vertical intervals, and I found that this is a very useful way to practice alone this kind of orientation between the different intervals. We get back a little bit to the pedagogical method of diminutions treatises when we get into florid counterpoint, and I don't need to reintroduce this. We saw it a bit yesterday. It's Giovanni Maria e Bernardino Nannino's counterpoint treatise, which has this regole a imparare a fare contrappunto a mente. And I think he intends us to memorize all of these figures, which he helpfully labels with numbers, by the way. I'll get back to that. I transcribed them because I don't have as good a copy as you do, I think, but I just have the online version from Bologna. And he gives us these figures, all of the possibilities for doing a falling fifth over a cantus firmus. And then just like Dalla Casa and Rognoni and some other counterpoint diminutions treatises, he does string them together so that we can practice them in sequence. So it still doesn't solve the problem of how to put it in context of a real piece, but at least we have our building blocks and we have some practice methods to get through them. And I think A71 was doing a similar thing when it went by the slides briefly. When we do start to put them in context, we have the most tried and true method in diminutions pedagogy is discussed by Luca Conforto, and he says, take an interval ornamentation out of the table and pigliarne copia, take a copy and put it in your piece in the corresponding spot. So here in Conforto, he's very economical with his paper, and he gives lots of possibilities on top of each other. So you have to see that for this descending second, I've drawn a little red line through the root that I'm going to take da ba di di di, and I'm going to put it in my ancorche col partire morire, just right there where I have exactly the same motion. So that's the principle of cut and paste, and that's how we can start to practice these building blocks in context. And one thing we can do, for instance, is we can take a specific diminution and say, okay, every time you see a rising second, you do this diminution. Every time you see a falling third, you do this diminution. And just have a very, very limited library. And every time you see that interval in the piece, you apply it until you really start to internalize these figures. In Counterpoint, I think we get to the issue of orientation, of getting lost much quicker. The only example I can think of where you really can't get lost, but you're practicing your intervals anyway, is the contrappunto bestiale alla mente, where you can say, okay, I'm here to recognize whether the cantus firmus note is consonant with mine. So, and even I think the cat is too complicated if you don't know some counterpoint. But you could do the cuckoo, and you could definitely do the dog, and probably the cuckoo. And if you're really clever, you could do the owl. And then the cat, you need to start learning musical orienteering. So how do we teach that? So orientation is where we are, and orienteering is, discovering where we are, or in the best case, not losing track of where we are as we walk through the selva dei vari passaggi, or the forests of counterpoint intervals. So what does orientation mean in practical terms? It means in diminution, ending a diminution where you intend to, and a lot of authors like Zacconi and Zanobi talk about, the diminution has gone on too long or has landed too short. And this can also, of course, happen in florid counterpoint. So it's a question of position, but it's also of timing, but it's also a question of position. My diminution has ended on the wrong note. I forgot that I need to leap a third if I'm going a step. I've jumped a third in my counterpoint and I landed on a seventh instead of a sixth. And so how do we start to teach students to get over these issues? And I think yesterday Marcello mentioned very briefly the mapping of consonances, that it has to do with building a mental map of what the consonances are and how they relate to each other. And of course we see this being built up in the theoretical apparatus of all these counterpoint treatises, but they don't necessarily translate then into a methodology. So, and this idea of having this counterpoint structure in your mind is referred to by various diminutions authors. For instance, Bartolomeo Barbarino gives a simple and a diminished version of each of his motets, and he says the simple version is for those who have counterpoint and they therefore can make their own passaggi. But if you don't have counterpoint, then you can't make your own passaggi and you have to sing the version that I've diminished for you. And so that led me to the question, well, what does he mean by to have counterpoint? And Luca Conforto again answers that question, I think. He says, those who have no understanding of the consonances, we can't work with them, but those who do know that leaping up a fourth from a fifth over the bass will make an octave. And this kind of very basic knowledge that without having to count on your fingers every time, that you know where every melodic interval is going to land as a vertical interval. No one puts it more clearly than Morley when Philomenes says, I pray you show me how the consonances may be perceived among other chords. And the master says, there is no way to discern them, but by diligent marking wherein every note standeth, which you cannot do but by continual practice. And so by marking where the notes stand and how far every one is from the next before, you shall easily know both what chords they be and also what chord cometh next. Okay, so that is musical orienteering in a nutshell. And I think we talked yesterday a lot about how we might find some tips and tricks in various theory sources, but ultimately continual practice is what we need to do. So how do we do this continual practice of putting, of improvising, whether diminution or counterpoint, in context? So one of the things I do is I make my students sing the numbers when they do my counterpoint exercises, or if they're string players, they can speak the numbers. But I do run into the issue that wind players, and for myself, as soon as I stop singing and speaking the numbers, I lose that sort of physical connection to where I am. Of course, my ears are telling me something as well, but also the timbre between the trombone and whatever it's playing with is suddenly different. So I need also a way to practice this on the trombone. And here I'm going to go back to counterpoint pedagogy, diminution pedagogy. And here we have the next section from Dalla Casa, where he gives ornamentations of small phrases. So here's the first phrase of Io canterei d'amor from Rore, and he gives the unornamented section before the first bar line, and then he gives the section that he's going to ornament after the next bar line, and after the bar line after that, he gives the ornamentation of that. So he has similar sections. In that one, he goes through really every phrase of the piece. Later on, he has also sections where he just takes out cadences. So he takes out one single cadence from S'amor la viva fiamma from the seconda parte, and gives you two different ornamentations of that. So he presents the simple one, and then an ornamentation in eighth notes, and then an ornamentation using 16th notes. So it's very pedagogical. But how do you actually practice this? Well, so I do a practice session in my trombone class, and everybody is sitting with dalla casa in front of them except for one person. We're sitting in a circle, and the one person at the end only has Rore's first book of four-part madrigals in front of them, the cantus part. So the person in the hot seat, I call that, is looking at what you see on the bottom, and everybody else is looking at what you see on the top. And then the first person will play the version that that is ornamented. Well, the first person plays the unornamented version, so that who's looking at the four-part madrigals knows where it's going to end. And then the next person plays the ornamented version. So it might sound something like this. Should? Nope. Well, I promise that will sound later on. We did test the audio. So the person, everybody else sees what you see on top, and the hot seat student only sees this. Maybe now there's a audio. There we go. So if you're in the hot seat, you're looking at the bottom, and you're hearing that, and you're trying to keep track of how the diminution is moving in relation to what you're seeing. When the person in the hot seat can then play it from memory. So everybody is playing this ornamentation, and when it gets to the person in the hot seat, we say, okay, well, can you play it now back to us? And sometimes they can right away, and sometimes they say, oh no, I have to practice a little bit more, and that's fine, there's no pressure. When they can play it, then the reward is we try it then in 4 parts. And what I love about this exercise is that what I love about it is that it only uses materials that would have been available to Dalla Casa and his students. So it's only using these publications. The score is from 1577. I think it's the first printed score. And it's also Rory's first book of 4-part madrigals. Now, I don't see any reason why we couldn't translate this method onto learning some basic counterpoint sequences. Now, so we do have sequences of counterpoint. They're just not so methodological that they're showing us one interval at a time. They're just, okay, now let's pile some intervals together. So I still think that using my workbook makes more sense at the beginning when you're trying to build building blocks. But then when you're trying to make whole phrases, then we can go back to the treatises. And what we get from the Dalla Casa exercise is that we're forced to learn how to chunk these 4-note patterns so that we're not thinking of a forest of 16 notes when we see them in front of us, but we see, oh, there's a da-da-da-da-da and a da-da-da-da-da, and we're seeing these patterns and chunking them into small groups. And I think that we could do exactly that exercise for counterpoint, but the person in the hot seat sees the cantus firmus, and everybody else plays the counterpoint, and then when you get to the hot seat, they have to repeat back the counterpoint. I have to admit I haven't tried this yet, but I think it would be a really good and useful way. I missed my chance 2 days ago, but I think it would be a really good and useful way to get people to start using their working memory to put in intervals of counterpoint without too much decision making. My goal is, I realize when I'm teaching beginners that they don't need to decide what the nicest interval is. They just need to be able to drill these intervals and put them into context. And I think that if you start having long phrases like this, and you need to memorize them, you also start to chunk larger groups of interval progressions together. And of course, the same goes with florid counterpoint. Chiodino gives us, and he also labels the intervals and even gives bar lines to help keep track of where we are. So he gives us very simple ornamented sections to begin, and then he gives us his musical commonplaces, which are almost always cadences, which is very helpful. And these commonplaces, I'm wrapping up very soon. These commonplaces have always sort of bothered me because you can't cut and paste them just directly into your, I mean, a keyboard player could, but I don't run into the situation where I can just cut and paste this. It's like in Duolingo where you come up with a sentence that you just can't use. So I found that about, the Ortiz very extended cadences and about the locis communibus of Chiodino. I thought, I can't cut and paste that into my daily life, and I just like this. So I have yet to use this one in conversation, for instance. So what do we do with these? And I think, but Philip proposed yesterday that they're a really good way to learn musical style, and I also think that they're a good way, if we can practice them, especially with others, to learn chunking. Of course, once we get into longer sentences, then we get our methodology back from the counterpoint treatises. Now, of course, we can continue to practice these the same way through memorization, but we can also start trying our own and start using the obligi proposed by Zacconi and Morley and Lusitano to restrict the kinds of counterpoints that we can do. And once we start having a fluid use of our building blocks, we can start to move on to the exercises that were actually given to us by our counterpoint teachers in the various treatises. So we also have whole pieces in diminution, of course, and this is where we also get back to the issue of judicio. How do we deploy these ornaments in the right places, on the right syllables of the text, or with the right affect, or if we want to involve a little bit of word painting. So it's when we get to these whole pieces that we can start to address these issues of style. But we also just get a lot of games proposed by Zacconi and Morley and others on how to then practice, but we have the building blocks hopefully under our belt. And I hope that with filling in the gap between these lists and lists of intervals and the examples that you see before you, that people can enjoy Morley, Lusitano, Zacconi, and everybody else to the fullest. So, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. We have time for one big or two small questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Just a short remark about Dalla Casa, because you explained, and I think you are completely right, that diminution treatises can inform us much about the way also counterpoint was taught, etc., etc. There is a methodology. In Dalla Casa, what is striking also is that he goes in a way like the species of counterpoint. Mm-hmm. That is, no? Exactly. Yeah. So that he starts, you have to play only crotchets, no? And then semi-quaver. Exactly. So exactly. So the diminution pedagogy is exactly copied after the counterpoint species. So there is a connection here, a further one.
I find that interesting also because the rules of counterpoint. I find it interesting because the rules of counterpoint, then they get looser and looser as you go from first species to second species to third species, and then when you get into diminution, you get people like Zarlino who complain about there being little mistakes and parallels and things, but Rognoni and I think about 6 other authors say, we're going to get these little parallels, but it doesn't matter because now it's moving really fast. In eighths and sixteenths and triplicate and 30 seconds, triplicate are 24th notes. We get these, they go by so fast that nobody cares anymore, honestly. So it kind of extends the license of counterpoint into diminution as well, but nobody talks about that, of course.
Other questions?
I'll be around at the break too.
Or maybe we can use the break to continue exchanging and continue on time now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
You need to connect your computer.
Laptop and an adapter,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if you just give me a second, I'll put it together.
Yeah.
Let's see that.
Tim Braithwaite is a teacher for counterpoint and analysis in the conservatoire in Amsterdam, and he studied music theory in Den Haag, and is since this year the leader of, as the artistic director of the Capella Pratensis. And we will hear a contribution dealing with very different counterpoints than we heard normally, because we tend to use typical patterns and typical schemata that lead to a nice result, and his paper is dealing with more eccentric results, some of them with lots of dissonances or some sounding especially good, and also close to what would be a written composition, and we are looking forward for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Eccentric, wow, okay. So first of all, good morning. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and to see so many faces of people who I know but probably don't know me. So I'd like to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about the use of models in ensemble improvisation, or rather, I suppose, the non-use of models, attempting to bring their status and their function into a slightly different focus, and, having done so, to discuss how this can affect the priorities of the early music classroom. Now, the title of this presentation is taken from a passage by Thomas Morley, who, when describing ensemble improvisation, says the following: "But some have stood in an opinion which to me seemeth not very probable, that is, that men accustomed to descanting will sing together upon a plain song, without singing either false chords or forbidden descant one to another, which, till I see it, I will ever think impossible. For though they should all be most excellent men, and every one of their lessons, by itself never so well framed for the ground, meaning that each of their individual improvisations are skillfully crafted against the plain chant, yet it is impossible for them to be true one to another." Now, despite Morley's skepticism, he tells us that this practice has been in times past in England, as every man knows, and is at this day in other places the greatest part of the usual music which in any church is sung. Such a description paints a colourful picture of musical life, describing both a degree of virtuosity and the apparent chaos which results. Indeed, it seems incredible that such a practice might have flourished alongside the smooth and polished contrapuntal idioms of the 16th and 17th centuries. However, a brief survey of today's literature reassures us that historical singers were able to coordinate their improvisations through the use of various models, formulae, and patterns, allowing them to produce safe and predictable counterpoint. Renaissance improvisation, as Julie Cumming tells us, is highly constrained. In order to produce correct improvised counterpoint, there is a limited set of choices for every new note. It is this very limitation of choice that makes it relatively easy to improvise in real time. Improvising in this way, therefore, is primarily a matter of fulfilling the obligations of the chosen model, with contrapuntal abnormalities primarily arising if the singer is incapable of reproducing the pattern. Let's briefly examine one of the most common models based on parallel motion, in which the highest voice moves in parallel tenths above a given melody, which proceeds in regular note values in the lowest voice. The simple principles required for such an improvisation are described by Vicente Lusitano, who says, "In concerto, one can easily sing, improvise, when the soprano always sings tenths above the plain chant, while the third part improvises as it pleases, except for singing 2/3 or 6ths, which would of course result in fifths and octaves. Now, I'm sure this model's familiar to many of you, but I've included a well-known example on the following slide. As you can see, the model produces a pleasing effect with little risk of internal dissonance between the added voices. Indeed, it's easy to see why this technique enjoyed such widespread popularity. However, surely the extended or even exclusive use of parallel motion is counterpoint only at its most basic. And even if the singer is able to disguise the simplicity of the model with embellishments, it seems hard to imagine that such a technique could have prompted authors such as Juan Bermudo to compare the improvisation he heard in Toledo to a good composition. Indeed, as Canguilhem tells us, oral counterpoint in the Renaissance period appears to be judged positively or negatively according to its closeness or remoteness to or remoteness from written composition. Can such simple tricks as this really be representative of this tradition? An answer is offered by Pietro Cerone, who explains that this way of creating counterpoint above a plain chant is something to be practiced only when there is a lack of singers who know how to improvise counterpoint. The passage is even accompanied by a note in the margin, which describes it as concerted counterpoint in times of necessity. And even though some people don't really like this way of improvising counterpoint because of the many tenths, you can still do it in an emergency if you're unable to do it better. While Lusitano presents this technique as an easy way of improvising in an ensemble setting, Cerone considers the simplicity of the model a shortcoming due to its reliance on the extended technique of parallel motion. Similar language is used by a number of authors from the 15th century onwards to describe models based around simple parallel motion, such as Desiderius Erasmus, who tells us that Faubourdon was only practiced by those who are too stupid to be able to learn the art of music, since it does not observe the harmonies of the art. The 16th century Hieronymite José de Sigüenza even suggests an economic advantage, telling us that fabordones could be sung by monks, creating an effect which otherwise could only be made by paid musicians. Another well-known model is described by Lodovico Zacconi, who tells us how two singers can improvise canons without music books. And here's the example he gives, which shows a typical canon at the unison, although he explains that the technique can be used to generate canons of a variety of sorts. However, he continues to warn the reader that this way of improvising is not to be done when among learned and intelligent people of music, but only among people who make no other judgment of music except for what their foolish and simple hearing provides, since it is more ridiculous than anything else to hear it continuing with little parallel thirds. As with the previous model, the technique is only to be used when there's no better option available, and the frequent parallel motion results in counterpoint that failed to meet the standard of educated musicians. However, perhaps the most extensive criticism, extensive objection to such formulaic methods of improvising can be found in the writings of Nicola Vicentino, who embarks upon a tirade which criticizes a whole host of model-based approaches, including the practice of singing parallel tenths in the upper voice, which he describes as easy to do, but because one hears so many tenths, it's not very pleasing. Methods of improvising canons, which he describes as crude, without variety. And the repetition and manipulation of short ostinato phrases, contrappunto fugato, as neither good nor useful. Indeed, like other authors, Vicentino seems to uphold written counterpoint as the standard, a standard that these models clearly failed to meet. This tension between written and improvised music is revealed in a series of comments by Adriano Banchieri, who attempts to devise a new technique of composition through which a composer can artificially create the effect of improvised counterpoint. His efforts stem from an observation about several collections of introits and antiphons published by his contemporaries, pointing out that since they're composed with osservate regole musicali, they should be called contrappunti osservati, not improvised alla mente counterpoint. This, he tells us, is because contrappunti osservati do not create the effect which is heard in those chapels with good musicians and singers. Now, despite this, Banchieri continues by providing a series of osservazioni, essentially contrapuntal restrictions, including our parallel 10th model, through which a composer can recreate the effect of improvised counterpoint on the page. Now, in doing so, he seems to contradict his own statement that osservazioni cannot create the effect of improvised counterpoint. Indeed, he later seems to recant this approach, saying, "I don't know what it means to put contrappunto alla mente into score, because it seems premeditated to me, or rather osservato, which will never be contrappunto alla mente, in which a singer does not know what the other will sing." Such a statement seems fundamentally to contradict a model-based approach to improvisation, in which specific contrapuntal patterns are pre-planned so that each singer knows more or less exactly what the others will sing. And yet, Banchieri is not the only author to emphasize the unplanned nature of improvised counterpoint. Seth Calvisius, for example, tells us that the improvisation which is in use amongst certain court musicians in chapels, certain monasteries, and amongst the papal singers is done without premeditation. Such an approach towards improvising counterpoint has been specifically associated with the term sortizatio by the Hungarian musicologist Ernst Ferrand, literally a type of music made by chance, who cites authors such as Ornithopachus and Volek. These writers distinguish between composition, in which all voices must be consonant with one another, and improvised counterpoint, in which it suffices for each voice simply to be consonant with the given melody. The result is a whole that Ferrand describes as unexpected, since the internal counterpoint between the added lines of the individual singers is unplanned. Now, hereinafter, the term sortizatio is almost exclusively found in German sources, and usually treated negatively. Gallus Dressler, for example, simply tells us that sortizatio is more common among foreigners than among us, before continuing to discuss composition. Johannes Nucius associates the technique primarily with the common craftsman in public taverns. However, he also describes how excellent musicians and those in the papal, imperial, and royal chapels make use of this type of singing. Like Faber, Nucius also disapproves of the practice, criticizing the inevitable dissonances which occur when several singers improvise together. For who is so sharp and subtle of mind that they can discern another's thoughts? Since this is impossible and can barely be achieved between two singers, let alone more, even if they're skilled artists, it follows that there is no certainty in this practice of singing, which mixes random consonances and does not rely on fixed principles or foundations. However, he adds that singers abroad could hide their faults when singing, since they supposedly surpassed the Germans in the fluency of their tongue and the agility of their voices, in which they're trained from childhood. And yet, why might the foreign singers described by Nucius and Dressler have engaged in such a discordant practice? Perhaps some clue can be found by examining Banchieri's eventual dismissal of the restricted and premeditated osservazioni. The use of the term to describe contrapuntal restrictions of this nature can be found occasionally in other sources, although this is not its most common usage. A comparable notion is that of obligo, which was also used to define certain restrictions by which a composer was bound, such as only using stepwise motion, strict internal canons, or such like. Obligi techniques become particularly popular in the first part of the 17th century, which saw the publication of several collections boasting their use. These techniques stretch the composer's invention to the limits, and several authors mention the difficulty in composing artfully around such restrictions, such as Giovanni Pietro del Buono, who asks his readers to be forgiving if they find any errors, whether in the printing or the composition, because the obligi, and particularly the canons, demand certain liberties. Although the difficulty in creating satisfying counterpoint when bound by these obligi became opportunities for composers and improvisers to display their virtuosity, not all practitioners appreciated such restrictions. Indeed, it's noteworthy that it's specifically the obligi of canonic techniques to which Vicentino objects, citing such restrictions as one of the reasons that canons cannot be full of harmony and beautiful singing, because the obligo of the fugue prevents it. Zarlino, who uses the term both to describe canonic techniques on a cantus firmus and the use of contrappunto fugato, further explains that although the use of such obligi can be impressive, it is not possible to observe the beauty and decorum of counterpoint, both in terms of modulation and also in terms of invention and the way of placing the consonances, because the freedom which the composer had to compose without any obligi is taken away. Indeed, now referring specifically to the practice of improvising canons against a cantus firmus, he continues to tell us that he does not much recommend their frequent use, since it's hardly possible, given that the contrapuntist is obliged to observe so many things, for the counterpoint to be rendered in such an elegant and sonorous manner that it gives pleasing delight to the ear. Such perspectives on contrapuntal restriction contextualize the criticisms of the improvisational models discussed previously. Their essentially formulaic nature, while ideal for the untrained musician, frustrates the experienced contrapuntist, whose skill is stifled by their limitations. Indeed, several other sources confirm Morley and Nucius's comments that such an individualistic, potentially virtuosic approach, in which several singers improvised counterpoint freely upon a given melody without prior coordination, was widespread. Zacconi, for example, describes the coexistence of both a model-based and a free approach, saying that a group of singers can either improvise in a flock and crowd, which is what happens every day in eminent chapels, or using sequences and obbligazioni. One of the clearest descriptions of this freer practice from the period is found at the end of the 15th century in the writings of the Flemish theorist Johannes Tinctoris, who explains the difference between res factor and improvised counterpoint, cantus super librum, as follows. Res factor differs from counterpoint above all in this respect, that all the parts of a res factor, be they 3, 4, or more, should be mutually bound to each other. But with 2 or 3, 4 or more singing together upon the book, one is not subject to the other. For indeed it suffices that each of them sound together with the tenor. He continues, however, to say, I do not judge it blameworthy, but rather very laudable, if those singing together should prudently avoid similarity between each other in the choice and order of concords. Thus, indeed, they shall make their singing together much more full and suave. Despite what the previous section suggests, this passage indicates that Tinctoris was concerned by the inevitable contrapuntal errors that arise, instructing that singers should avoid singing the same consonances at the same time, perhaps referring to the resultant parallel octaves, fifths, and unisons, as well as perhaps the textural results of undesired doublings. However, a closer reading of the passage reveals that this concern is not presented as a rule, but simply as a guideline. While Tinctoris states that it is better for singers to avoid similarity between each other, he nowhere describes this as obligatory, simply preferable. A similar passage can be found in the 14th century Quatuor Principalia Musicae, which tells the reader that if 2 or 3 sing descant over a plain chant, they ought, as much as possible, to begin and continue in different concords. For if one of them coincides with another and sings in the same concord, they should immediately shift to another concord, to a different concord. The approach described here clearly suggests the absence of a predetermined model, but instead requires that singers be aware of what their fellows are doing and adjust their improvisation in the moment, as much as possible. Indeed, the scope for internal contrapuntal errors in such a practice, besides the forbidden parallel intervals, is narrow if the given melody occurs in either the highest or the lowest voice, with the primary occasion for unwanted dissonance arising only if one singer sings a sixth, while another sings a fifth, or if one singer attempts a dissonant suspension at an inopportune moment. Now, unsurprisingly, several authors do indeed attempt to limit the use of these features, although it seems that attempts to enforce such rules were often disregarded. Zacconi, in fact, tells us explicitly that such prescriptions were ignored in many chapels. He begins, as expected, by prescribing limitations on the use of sixths, fourths, and suspensions. He continues, however, by seemingly trying to convince the reader of this approach, because although it seems this way is quite restricted, and that few good things can be done with it, nevertheless, one can achieve whatever one wishes. But, as the proverb goes, This is not a skill for everyone. And when beginners start to learn, they're not given much instruction about it. As a result, in many chapels, when counterpoint is heard, because the singers are not listening to each other and have no interest in giving it much thought, instead of hearing sweet and elegant figures, it feels like hearing a great crowd of those men who hawk spices in Venice on the Rialto and elsewhere. Now, despite his efforts, it seems like his advice is often ignored, and he blames both a lack of education and the willfulness of those singers who have no interest in such restrictions, presumably since, as he says, they believe that few good things can be done with it. The resultant effect, he tells us, is chaos, and indeed, complaints about chaotic improvisation can be found throughout the period in question. Despite this potential for chaos, it's notable that theorists, including those who are critical of the practice, such as Nucius, frequently associated such a free approach with excellent musicians, those in the papal, imperial, and royal chapels. Zacconi even tells us that it occurred every day in eminent institutions, and several authors tell us of instances of competition and individual virtuosity which suggest great skill on behalf of the singers. In light of the appeal of such improvisatory freedom, it seems clear why accomplished singers might have rejected the restrictions of a model-based approach, especially considering its association with amateurish music making and unsatisfying counterpoint. What then does this mean for us in the modern classroom? Talking from my own experience, in my lessons at the Conservatoire in Amsterdam, the early music students are stuck with me for 2 years, during which they learn historical solmization, notation, as well as improvised and written counterpoint. The theory students also learn, we work with analysis. While the basic models of parallel motion and simple canons are discussed and practiced, the main focus when it comes to improvisation is on the spontaneous addition of a single voice to a given melody, starting with simple note against note counterpoint, and then progressing, through various means, to free and florid singing. Aside from continuous reference to their written counterpoint sessions, which I think is an important part of this, their written counterpoint sessions, which aim to teach students how to compose 2, 3, and 4-part pieces in Renaissance style, 2 fundamental historical tools are used to teach improvisation, and I'm just going to briefly skirt over them because I don't think I have lots of time. The first is something going to explode over there? That's fine, no problem. This is all good. The first is citing, a technique of visualization which allows the singer to imagine the notes they'll sing against a given melody. What this means, in essence, is that students quickly compose a counterpoint on the spot, imagine it on the same staff as the given melody, and then read their own composition in real time. Without the use of this skill, Lusitano tells us that the singer will be wandering about like the blind. The second fundamental are the building blocks, which Catherine mentioned earlier, in which simple contrapuntal patterns are memorized to be regurgitated at the ideal moment. Now, I've chosen to highlight these 2 tools, and again, I'm also around in the break, we can talk more about them in detail later. But I've chosen to highlight these 2 tools partly for their historical relevance, of course, but actually primarily since they relate to my own practice of improvisation as a singer myself. As the leader and as a singer within the ensemble Capella Pratensis, which has been performing Renaissance and medieval music from historical notation for almost 40 years now, usually in the context of a liturgical reconstruction, I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity to improvise regularly in concert, raising my blood pressure significantly over the past few years, both freely, but also using many of the models described above, especially on psalm tones and psalm recitations and that sort of thing. From my own experience, the result of combining these 2 tools, citing and the building blocks, is a combination of on-the-spot creation and muscle memory, which is precisely what I aim to cultivate in my students. Indeed, it's my hope that these 2 techniques together with the melodic awareness gained from solmization classes, as well as their lessons in written counterpoint and analysis, help students see improvising counterpoint not as merely the application of these theoretically safe formulae, but really as a singer's art, limited only by their own ingenuity and skill. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Questions? We have time. Ian.
Well, okay, maybe I can sort of ask both Catherine and Tim. Thanks very much, Tim, for really interesting talk. I was hoping that you would then say, yes, then I tried with my students this form of counterpoint or whatever, chaos counterpoint, where only the intervals or the relationship with the cantus firmus counts and not. But have you actually tried that with your classes?
Yes, with my classes, but also last year in the. Thank you. Yes, with my classes, I have to say they find it difficult. It requires a degree of self-assuredness, if that's a word, for them to be able to sort of ignore the parallels in particular, which result. In fact, parallels are more of a problem than the dissonances which you'd find with, for example, fifths and sixths occurring at the same time. But maybe more interesting, last year, was it 2 years ago, at the Festival of Improvisation in Lausanne, I gave a concert which used this technique rather a lot. And it was myself and 3 other singers, with myself and 1 other singer, Jason Marmaras, for those of you who know him, improvising essentially freely over various different plain chant melodies in the context of a liturgical reconstruction. And it was great fun. There were quite a lot of clashes, as you'd expect. And there is a recording, I think, floating around somewhere. If you're very interested, I could probably send it to you. There are quite a lot of clashes, a few parallels, but the result is generally rather pleasant, if you don't mind me saying so. This was with 2 singers, and maybe the parallels in particular were more noticeable. But with some of these authors describing this happening with far more singers, I can imagine that it becomes a sort of cloud of sound a little bit more. And in fact, now I think about it, Catherine, were you there for this concert? We did this Isaac Mass, the Missa Pascale with Capella. Well, in Laos. No, yes, you were there 2 years ago. Yeah, we did a similar. Yeah, okay. I seem to remember actually you. That makes sense. We did something similar based on just the final chant of the piece. We sang the Ite Missa Est and Deo Gratias, and we practiced it. Yeah. Right. That's it. Yeah, I remember. So we did it there as well. And the result is that was with more singers and some instrumentalists. Josue was there playing a billion fast notes over the cantus firmus. And the effect was colourful and exciting. And sure, there were parallels. I didn't notice them, I have to say. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, yeah, just a little bit of insight in the process. I did have another question, but if anyone else wants to.
Thank you so very much. I have a question for you and for David, perhaps, on the differences of the Italian sources and the Spanish sources, because they seem to contradict each other quite heavily in how they evaluate canons and what they said about it becoming boring when there's too much imitation. Could you elaborate on that, please?
I think David's probably the person to elaborate on that, actually.
Sources like Banchieri that suggest that you could have lots of people doing this contrappunto in compagnia, these lots of people improvising at the same time without taking care of the others, just rather not taking the sixth. This is in fact very different. In Spain, we have the sources of contrappunto concertado in the treatises being very restrictive about what you can do and what not. However, later sources like Nazaré 1723 says that in the churches, especially in the village, people sing together counterpoint. Those who know rules sing according to the rules that they have learned, and the others sing just al sentido, just by following their ears. And he suggests that they sing together, values this in a positive way, and later Jimeno will comment that as a former chaos. That's luckily this has disappeared, this habit of singing counterpoint in the church. So it's valued later very negatively. So maybe it existed, but not in the chapels of the cathedrals. At least theoretically, the goal was to sing very clean, according to the rules.
Yes, there's another question.
For Italy, you can say maybe more. Right?
Well, no, I just wanted to, I'm sure you're absolutely right. I included the Nassar quote, actually, but unfortunately I ran over my time rather significantly and had to cut half my presentation. There's another really interesting source by Pollio, which is writing right at the end of the 18th century, who describes, he describes a similar sort of chaos going on in these churches. So I think it's just really nice to remember that these sorts of things, although we tend to focus, of course, on the highest quality of whatever that means, the highest standard of music making at each time, that really this is a cherry on top of a very large and robust cake of musical practice in general. So I don't know if that's answers your question, but I think it's an interesting point to make, that while we tend to focus only on the tip of the iceberg, to use another metaphor, the rest of it is also interesting and perhaps a better representative of musical life.
Thank you, Tim. I think we have to, because there were two different options, no? Chaos and very well prepared and a counterpoint. I think it is a matter also of function. This is very important. I mean, there are times or situations when you can sing chaotically, so to speak, and other where you have to follow a very pure and counterpoint. When Banchieri states that, you know, this chaos is fantastic, and I don't want that you polish it, because or otherwise you will lose the real. He says the real spirit of contrappunto, la mente. But he specifically speaks of the introitus. Okay, introitus is the beginning, the call, no, for the mass. When you have to, it's like the bells a little bit. So you have to call people, please, now Mass is starting, please get into the cathedral, the church. And so they have to make noise. And there is this space of freedom for every singer to sing whatever he wants according to his own rules, but without paying attention to what your neighbor will do. Whereas in other situations, and this you can find also in some Spanish sources, that this chaotic, without paying attention with what with what the neighbor will do. And you have other situation with soloists. I mean, it is it's trios, or maybe 4 parts, but not more, where you have to be very careful and sing as it would be composed exactly. So I think it is also a matter of situation and circumstances.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I was very, very careful to try and not frame it as one versus the other, either or, but to emphasize that they do both exist and have different statuses and functions. Interesting observation regarding the introit. I hadn't considered that was perhaps a sort of announcement of course. Yeah, makes sense. Although I would say that authors like Juan Perez describes it happening in the Alleluia, for example. But anyway, there are a couple of elements which I'd maybe like to address. One is that I think it's very easy. The argument that I'd anticipated was to somehow frame this chaos as being the opposite of notated music. That we could say, how could, and sort of how I framed it at the beginning, how could we understand this chaotic approach existing at the same time as an otherwise, what did I say, an otherwise pure or an otherwise clean performance of notated, the smooth polyphony of the 17th and 16th centuries. But I think that, and so I'm going to answer my own point instead of directly yours, if you don't mind. I think that this is a slight fallacy to understand notated music also as being pure and clean, and then this being the opposite of that. As Catherine pointed out, the number of authors who say that if you ornament fast enough, then it doesn't matter about parallel fifths and octaves. That's pretty amazing. It's a few, right? Yeah, and Zenobi, for example, specifically says that it's the job of the singer to introduce dissonances where the composer hasn't written them. So the idea that we have a chaotic sort of improvisation going on here, as opposed to an otherwise theoretically neat and clean composed practice, I think that's an opposition which isn't necessarily going to have been reflected in this time. Which doesn't directly answer your question. It was just a point I wanted to make I didn't have time for in the main body of my speech. And I had another response to what you said, but thank you. It was really nice to emphasize the contextualization of both of these elements. Thank you.
I would suggest it's great to see that there are lots of questions, but maybe we could ask and answer and discuss also during the coffee break and later in the round table. Please keep your questions because I think they're very interesting topics, and we continue with coffee. Thanks.
Das ist Tims Laptop jetzt. Ah, das ist deiner. Ich habe alles auf USB-Stick. Du hast keinen Schweizer Stecker. Dann frage ich Catherine, ob ich ihren Laptop nehmen kann. Ja, ja.
Laisser les micros ouverts.
Ah ouais.
Les ouvre, je les ferme.
Ah ouais, ok.
Voilà, donc il n'y a pas de souci.
Ça marche.
Plutôt que de rappuyer, de
Ok.
rappuyer.
Ouais, c'est ça. Ok, ça marche.
Hein, merci.
Super, merci. Thank you. I understand a lot of things with your presentation. It makes more sense. All these,
Having seen the concept as well.
yes, yeah. And also, reading the treatises, some people said, oh, but it only has to be offered in tenor, and we understand also the Francis. I was missing these kind of topics, so yeah,
really kind.
really great.
So what's happening with Niels' presentation now? It's not now then?
Yes, it's now.
Because I see that this
No, they are bring after.
okay,
Yes,
right, that's fine.
but yes, we are. I think as soon as they fix the thing, you can go ahead.
Great, I'll just grab my laptop. No, I think I have everything.
Perfect. Yeah.
So, should I, no, it's fine. Should I do it with Niels? Yeah, no, of course. I was just worried that it's all good.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
You can let the microphone over there. And I think at the end, just before the lunch, we can gather together just like this, make a photo. The whole group, make a photo of the whole group in the same place. We can announce just to make a souvenir.
I suggested
Yeah, that's why we put her at the end. Yeah.
and additionally
Okay, ready when you are.
we continue, yeah? Please, we are going to continue. And luckily, we cannot hear Niels Berentsen personally here. He's the father of this event. And it's really a pity that we cannot hear him personally, but he has sent us the paper, and Tim will read it. I don't need to present Niels here, I think. And we wish him, if he's looking maybe through the live stream, we wish you that you get well soon. Niels, we miss you.
Yeah, I hadn't considered he'd be watching through the live stream. I need to actually now read what he told me to. No, it's obviously a real shame that Niels can't be here, but I'm happy to read in his voice. So, first of all, dear colleagues, dear friends, this paper comes to you in the form of a chose faite, as circumstances do not allow me to deliver it in person. I cannot begin to express my regret to miss these journées d'études and the many wonderful exchanges that are taking place within them. However, the past week or so has taught me that it's sometimes a good thing to be replaceable, at least to an extent, and I am grateful to my fellow organizers Antoine Schneider and David Mesquita for extending to you the hospitality I would have liked to offer myself, to Tim Braithwaite for reading this paper, as well as to Martin Erhardt for singing Counterpoint in my stead in Leipzig last week. I know I am not a vox clamantis in deserto, but among friends, at least in spirit and over Wi-Fi. Finally, I regret not being able to answer any questions or remarks you may have on my paper, but I'm sure there will be future occasions for discussing them. So, improvised counterpoint as reenactment. Scholarly and pedagogic considerations are often intertwined when talking about improvised counterpoint. Ever since Ernst Ferens's 1938 Die Improvisation in der Musique scholarship on this topic has, at least partly, been motivated by the possibility of reviving those practices in the modern classroom. Ferens's frustration at the lack of a practical theory education, leading to the inability of musicians to accompany even the simplest song or chorale melody, he told me to do this, by the way, still rings true today. Furthermore, Ferens's solution to this problem, looking to the past to discover better, or at least different methods to teach counterpoint and improvisation, is still what motivates many of us, including myself, to do the research in this area. At the same time, this blending of historical and pedagogic priorities, of then and now, if you wish, should give us pause. The past, far from being a foreign country we could visit, is ultimately lost to us. Concretely, for all the information that historical sources such as scores, treatises, archival records, etc. provide, we will never actually be able to hear Josquin improvise on plain chant, or watch him teach counterpoint to a young choir boy. Most of us, I assume, would agree that learning by doing may at least provide some insights into these long-lost practices. In this sense, the modern classroom revival of improvised counterpoint may be compared to reenactments with an educational purpose, for example, in living history museums. In both cases, past practices are reenacted in the here and now to gain a type of experiential knowledge which, supposedly, mirrors that of our forebears. What exactly are the advantages and limits to such approaches? For example, I do not think one can expect a modern-day student to memorize all 276 progressions taught by the Vatican Organum Treatise, as Anna Maria Busserberger argues was historical practice. On the positive side, like reenactments, historical improvisation provides participants with the occasion to time travel, that is, to immerse themselves deeply and experientially in the music of another epoch. A comparison with reenactment practices in other fields provides a good way to assess, first, what type of knowledge is acquired through such experiences, and, second, how they relate to an inevitably modern context. This paper will compare practices from other fields to those in historically informed music theory classes. In doing so, it aims to assess the challenges and affordances of pedagogic reenactment in the 21st century counterpoint classroom. Reenactment denotes a variety of activities in which aspects of the imagined or hypothesized past are performed in the present, in contexts ranging from leisure, such as battle reenactments, to education, such as living history museums, and academia. Whilst some of these activities owe their existence simply to being fun and indulging the twin passions of work and play, others aim to explore aspects of the past that prove difficult to access otherwise. These practices are referred to as either reconstruction, reenactment, replication, reproduction, and reworking in different disciplines. The status of RRR methodologies is a topic of debate, but they are generally considered a unique way to approach the black box of skill, the tacit or gestural knowledge of historical subjects. A well-known field of such research is experimental archaeology, a subdiscipline in which archaeologists test hypotheses about the uses of prehistoric artifacts and vehicles. Archaeologists debate the role which experiential knowledge should play in their discourse, and particularly how the discipline should relate to living history, performances by non-scientists. Whilst seeking out an authentic experience, either for themselves or the spectator, living history performers are not typically as rigorous in the selection of materials and methods as an experimental archaeologist. In other words, the domain of archaeology, in a broad sense, contains a variety of reenactment practices that range from the purely scientific to edutainment. Similar phenomena exist in other disciplines. For instance, some instructors use the replication of historical experiments as a tool in history of science classes. Students taking part in such pedagogic replications report gaining insights into the know-how of early experimentalists, which could not be obtained from reading their publications and experimental protocols alone. When it interacts with textual sources, recipes, experimental protocols, or historical accounts, reenactment is often seen as a type of critical reading. In this sense, historians occasionally perform reenactment as well. Mary Carruthers, for instance, describes practicing a medieval mnemonic technique while commuting between work and home on the Chicago elevated train. It appears that this experience shaped one of the central theses of Carruthers' work, namely that the utility of such techniques lies in the retrieval rather than the storage of memories. Summing up, reenactments serve different purposes and, by consequence, involve different stakeholders. Some are conducted exclusively as experiments by professional researchers and aim to tentatively produce knowledge about historical artifacts and practices. Others serve an educational purpose and are used to teach students in an engaging and interactive way, producing a type of haptic or experiential knowledge as a byproduct. Others, again, act as edutainment, allowing the general audience to experience a historical site or open-air museum in a vivid way. On the extreme end of this continuum, amateur reenactment, for instance of US Civil War battles, becomes virtually indistinguishable from live action role-playing, LARP, in which participants portray fictional or historical characters in a scripted story. The affordances of learning counterpoint improvisationally have been touched upon in many talks or demonstrated during workshops in this conference. Hence, I can be brief in summing them up. Improvising counterpoint, like historical reenactment, is work and play. Students tend to react well to a playful, interactive, and practical approach, where simple elements, such as interval progressions, are concentrated into larger units, and singing or playing precedes writing. This is sometimes equated with native speaking. Whether or not this comparison holds, most beginners do, in my experience, learn counterpoint quicker and better by improvising than in writing alone. The reason for this, I would argue, is that improvising on the spot makes it explicit that counterpoint is a skill or practical knowledge, knowing how, not declarative knowledge, knowing that. In other words, it motivates or gently pushes the student to actually practice. The idea of learning as they did can also be a good motivator, especially for early music students. This brings me to the limitations, practical and theoretical, of reviving historical practices in the counterpoint classroom. Of these, I see three main kinds: functional limitations, what can we use it for? Methodological limitations, how can we do it? And ethical limitations, should we? Let us start with its functional limitations. Looking back at the renaissance of improvised counterpoint over the last century or so, I think it is fair to conclude that this has been a mainly classroom revival. To put it a bit provocatively, improvised counterpoint is not very likely to become, as it once was, a marketable skill. Neither, of course, is Neolithic pottery. The usefulness of reenactive pedagogies, in other words, is hardly ever direct and unmediated. They offer the learner an experience which can inspire or inform further academic work and eventually their professional or artistic practice. As such, the fact that improvised counterpoint remains a marginal phenomenon in concert life should not necessarily be seen as a problem. Concerning methodological limitations, how can we do it? I would like to concentrate on the use of evidence from historical theoretical texts. As we are well aware, our handbooks or handouts are often not very similar to medieval or Renaissance treatises. To take the example of improvised canon, John Milsom's Stretto Fuga, none of the two modern presentations shown here by Dennis Collins and Barnabé Genin look much like Lusitano's from the Introduzione Facilissima. Yeah? Really? Okay. Without arguing which presentation is better, we can simply observe the differences. Both modern texts give rules for single melodic steps, presented on a table and/or a staff, whereas the Introduzione shows longer examples of sequential patterns, the Gegenschritte of German literature. It is true that both Collins and Genin show these patterns later on, but I nevertheless think this difference is illuminating. For one, it fits with Anna Maria Busser-Berger's description of medieval and, by extension, Renaissance pedagogy as starting from the memorization of individual cases, with general rules given afterwards or not at all. With their schematic, mathematical presentation of Stretto Fuga, modern authors do the inverse of the Introduzione, which starts from formulas. These and similar examples reveal that the modern revival of improvised counterpoint has, in some ways, been quite selective in its reading of historical sources. This should not come as a surprise. Every type of historical endeavor is, to a degree, but it is good to be aware what choices were made and why. Answering this question honestly should involve admitting that, for most of our students, learning contrapuntal improvisation in a truly historical way, involving extensive rote learning and many hours of daily practice, would represent an excessive time investment, irreconcilable with modern-day academic curricula and, more importantly, with modern-day life. Now, none of this would be surprising to reenactment practitioners in other fields. One does not aim to reenact the past wholesale, but seeks to perform a particular act, whether technical, artistic, or otherwise, which allows one to learn something about a historical object or practice. Hence, I would argue, the pedagogue of improvised counterpoint may likewise be quite frank about the limitations of reenacting a particular historical method, for example, by reducing the rote learning of countless formulae to just 2 or 3, and conduct these in a spirit of concerted, collaborative exploration, in which the student is experimenting themselves rather than being experimented upon. This brings me to the ethical limitations of pedagogical reenactment, should we? All kinds of evidence, pictorial, archival, and literary, point to the fact that medieval and early modern school was far from a safe space for learners. Verbal, physical, and sexual violence emanate, for instance, from this ostensibly droll depiction of a fox and a hound teaching chant, or perhaps counterpoint, to a group of geese in a 1510 Nuremberg gradual. It is obvious we do not seek to reenact this type of abuse. However, the uncomfortable question of how the master-apprentice pedagogies of the past were underpinned by systemic violence is not one that can simply be ignored. Another relevant consideration is the degree to which playing mass is acceptable to an increasingly diverse, multicultural, and often secularized student population. Whilst one can use questions about the provenance of a cantus firmus to address the historical origins of contrapuntal improvisation, the counterpoint classroom, I feel, is not the place to teach Christian doctrine and liturgy. For this reason, one may actually prefer using textless or newly written cantus firmi, as opposed to Gregorian chants or the Psalms of the Genevan Psalter. Ethical limitations, likewise, are discussed and theorized in the literature on experimental archaeology. The question of gender comes up, for instance, in the case of non-male practitioners of male historical crafts, for instance. But considerations of accuracy here are quickly discarded on account of the different height and physical condition of past and present individuals. Whilst these considerations cannot be translated one-to-one to musical practices, one could argue similar adjustments adapting historical practices to the different vocal, mental, and psychosocial makeup of modern individuals are not only defensible, but simply inevitable. To conclude, we can say that the limitations of the revival of improvised counterpoint are quite typical of reenactment practices at large. If these limits are discussed in a transparent way, staying clear of all claims of authenticity, they also form no obstacle to either their pedagogic usefulness or the tentative knowledge that modern practices may produce about the past. Compared to the fields of archaeology or the history of science, however, early music studies lack space dedicated to experimentation. Neither the classroom nor the concert hall are ultimately effective venues for fundamental research, because each impose their strictures on the process and its desired outcomes. As to the former, even if audiences may be curious to hear improvisations, the pressure of having one's improvisation stand next to the works of the great polyphonists of the past may lead performers to over-rehearse, or indeed cheat, at improvising. In other words, just like the need for a clear, progressive course curriculum, this evidently limits the ways in which such reenactments can act as a vehicle of knowledge production. This points to the need for dedicated spaces for the trial and error of experimental processes, in which negative as well as positive results are welcome. To this end, the SFNS-funded project Reimagining and Reenacting Polyphony 2026-29, of which I will act as the principal investigator, will organize dedicated experimental sessions to advance our knowledge of mental and vocal polyphonic musical creation in the later Middle Ages. Our aim is to focus each session on a particular treatise or genre of polyphony from this period, running a controlled experiment over 5 days, with skilled, professional, and importantly paid participants. Similar informal initiatives exist, of course, but this will be, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that such experiments will be conducted as an RRR methodology within an academic research project. The advantages are evident. It allows for the careful planning and documentation of experiments, as well as the analysis and dissemination of results. A final important lesson of reenactment practices across disciplines concerns the nature of knowledge produced in them. First, this knowledge has an essential, an essential corporeal, multisential, and experiential dimension component, which, if not documented and verbalized, risks remaining inarticulate in the academic discourse. In a sense, this also applies to the participants or learners in reenactments. If they are not encouraged to reflect upon their experiences in discussions or writing, or solidify them through regular practice outside of the classroom, the skills obtained may be quickly forgotten. In my experience, going back to written counterpoint or historically informed composition is actually the best way to ensure lasting results. Second, the selective use of historical information and reenactment means that experiences gained by them are at best historically informed or inspired, rather than historical. Transparency about this is a simple matter of intellectual honesty. RRR methodologies from other fields indicate it is perfectly acceptable to select which parameters, materials, etc. one wants to recreate, as long as this is consistent with the purpose of the experiment. Good practices, in my view, consist of bringing together a digest of particular historical source to class, and to experiment with it together with one's students. I successfully applied this, for instance, to singing Faubourdon hymns in the style of Dufay, where one can reverse engineer the compositions and enrich one's own improvisations with tricks observed in the repertoire. In this way, like reenactments by historians of science or literature, improvising counterpoint can become a type of critical reading, i.e., a musical analysis. Third, and finally, the illusion of time travel on the subjective level of the participant, while being theoretically problematic, can nevertheless be beneficial. The discourse on reenactment shows that this phenomenon can be a powerful motivator for reenactors, enabling them to forge emotional and haptic connections to artifacts, which aid in the retention of knowledge and skill. In other words, even if one is aware an experience can never be fully historical or authentic, the temporary suspension of disbelief can be useful and defensible. A remark like, "Now I finally understand how they did it," should not be dismissed offhand by the instructor, but be used to start an open conversation about the particular nature of the insights gained. Thank you.
Of course, we cannot ask Niels now directly. We will find other opportunities to talk with him and to ask, but we can also, I think there are many very fundamental questions about these thoughts by Niels that we could share in the round table and discuss as well about what we are doing here finally and why. Thanks. Thanks, Tim, for reading the paper.
Niels has just sent me a message saying if anyone there is worried about me, he's feeling well, but is just a little tired.
Thanks, Niels. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Caroline Sordia, who studied singing and improvisation in Ghent, and early music in Brussels, and then in Basel, shown and singing, medieval singing, and spending not only time together in the improvisation class, but also singing in the masses and having this kind of experience, and enriching us also with her previous experience with Georgian music that she is. I think it's a very interesting transfer for us to put together living traditions of oral polyphony with what we are doing here, like reviving, reenacting this dinosauria. Thanks.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me to this conference, also to Niels. I feel very humble and grateful speaking after all these people who have, for most of them, been my teachers and my inspirations to go into improvised counterpoint, but also into early music as a whole, even if they sometimes don't know it. For example, I learned solmization from someone who had learned it from Isaac. So he doesn't know, but indirectly he has also inspired me. I hope that my talk will not be too chaotic for obvious reasons, personal reasons. My life is a bit of a chaos at the moment, so it will be somehow improvised and chaotic, but I think it remains in the theme of the chaotic voices we just heard about. Counterpoint in a panther's skin. Why panther's skin? This refers to a famous epic poem of the 12th century by a Georgian poet Shota Rustavelli. And the title of the poem is this, Vepris Grasoani. It can be translated as the night in a panther's skin. It's a bit of a joke or a little bit of a pun, just because people say that if you need to read this poem to understand the Georgian soul. I haven't read this poem, only fragments of it, but I'm half Georgian, so my dad is Georgian, my mom is French, and we have been singing with my father and my sister. It's a family in which we sing this polyphonic tradition. So that's why I wanted to give a little bit of an impression of what this practice has to maybe teach us, or what kind of questions can it raise for us in our practice of improvised counterpoint. I just put some quotes from the Night in the Panther's Skin, just because these quotes are used in everyday life as expressions or sayings, and sometimes also taken up in song. We'll see this later. And these are miniatures of some of the manuscripts. It used to be in the dowry of every woman, a girl who would marry. She would have an exemplar of the book. So Georgia, I just put this map so that people know where it is. I think most people know now. There have been some wars and everything, but still, it's useful to locate this. As you can see, it's really a country with a lot of mountains, the Caucasus Mountains, and it can be divided into about 15 regions in terms of dialect, but also in terms of singing dialects. On this map, you see there's been a separation between East and West. You could say very generally that the East has had more influence of its eastern neighbors, of Azeri music, of Persian music, and the West has remained a bit more in its own tradition of mountains. People often say Georgia is a polyphonic island in a sea of monophonic traditions. It's not completely true. We have polyphonic traditions in different places in Europe, mostly in islands or in mountainous regions. So it's also a whole question where does this polyphony come from? Because it comes from usually people who have, for example, who are pre-Indo-European. So Georgian is not part of the Indo-European family. It has its own family of languages. It's a very archaic culture, language tradition. So 15 musical dialects. Historians have elements to believe that the polyphonic tradition is very ancient, with sources as early as the 8th century mentioning the culture of the people living in what is now called Georgia, and how they cheered themselves with their joyous songs. So there are some elements in the songs of pre-Christian references, for example, that make us believe that this has been going on for quite a long time. Yes, they also musicologists in the 19th century, when there has been this revival, looking for traditions everywhere else in Europe. It was also happening in Georgia, and they noted that when a single individual would sing, they would sing a monophonic song, but as soon as you would have more than one person, then polyphony would immediately ensue. There is no such thing as singing a monophonic song altogether. as soon as you have more than one person, then you would sing in different voices. It's usually 3-part polyphony almost everywhere in Georgia, and they have a whole theory about that, you know, especially in sacred polyphony, saying it's like the Trinity, and that's why it's 3 voices. It's because it's sacred. But as I said, this tradition seems to be pre-Christian, and we have sacred repertoire and secular repertoire. They're not as separate as it looks, because again, the sacred repertoire sometimes just makes use of pre-Christian elements and then sort of Christianizes them. For example, we have Allilo becoming Alleluia, this kind of things. And it has been recognized by UNESCO as part of the World Heritage Intangible, how to say? Intangible, yeah. What are the main features? The interesting thing is it's all been orally transmitted, and we don't have any manuscripts of Georgian polyphonic tradition. We have some manuscripts of chant. So I will not talk too much about the sacred music, but we have some manuscripts in which we have one voice notated, but it's sung polyphonically, and there are no treatises as to how, why, what are the rules. This is all then musicologists trying to make sense of. It's still a living practice. Maybe I didn't say that, but that's the important thing, is that people still sing in Georgia. It's not as widespread as it used to be, and in some families it's passed down, in some families it is not passed down. It depends on the regions, but it's still very much a living tradition. I will go briefly on this because I don't think it's really the important thing today, but it has a specific tuning system. Interestingly, or anecdotally, as I was, when I learned solfège in music school, I tried to notate the Georgian songs I knew, and I was very confused because I did not know how to write this. I didn't know if it was major third or minor third, and all of a sudden I doubted my knowledge. I was like, I think I don't know the song so well because I'm not even sure how to write it. And then much later, I figured out, it's just that there is no such thing as a major or minor third. There's just a neutral third. That's why I didn't know how to notate it. But it's interesting how we value sometimes so much the knowledge we acquire in institutions and then tend to doubt our own embodied knowledge of things we know how to do. What does this music sound like? I think it's better if I just make you listen to it. So we have, interestingly, there have been many recordings in the early 19th century, so not so much writing down, but recording. So I think this is one of the earliest recordings we have. Let's see. Does it work now? How do I do this? Probably need to escape. David, you know how to? Wait. Yes. Yes. No, it's going to work. It's going to work. Sorry for the abrupt ending, but I think you have an idea. And this is more typical of Western dialects. So what sounds to our very dissonant to our ears, but and as you can hear, I don't know if you can hear, but you have improvising soloists on the top, 2 voices, and then basically everybody else who's present is singing the bassus voice. So there's no such thing as just listening to the music. If you're in the room, you have, even if you don't know the song, you'll figure out the bass voice. You have enough people. And just as a contrast, you can listen to this song from the Eastern tradition. So the Eastern tradition, well, just listen to it, and then we can talk. This song was sent with Voyager into space as a representative of human culture. I'm really sorry. It's out of lack of time. But you can hear also again improvising. They have some room for improvisation and for ornamentation, but you have at least soloistic upper voices, and everybody else holding the drone. So let's revert back to. Yes. Yes.
Oh, that should not be this way. But the wrong one. What's that?
I don't know if you. We closed it. It's okay.
Okay, sorry.
This one. Yes. Thank you. So you hear the texture is a bit different with this Eastern tradition. It's maybe more harmonious to our ears. Some other features of this music is that it's very functional. So the songs are, this is for example a table song, something you would sing before eating or while eating. You give another toast and you sing a song. You have work songs. I think the one before is probably a work song that you use while in the field or doing some other repetitive activity. You have songs to heal the sick. You have songs to welcome babies into the world. You have songs for all kinds of occasions, wedding songs, etc. Yeah, well, this is. I will go back to this later. They're also highly segregated and gendered, the repertoires, but this seems to be a later thing because in the more isolated regions, men and women still sing together. So there's no such thing as your octave is not the right octave, or musicologists believe it's the introduction of Christianism is one of the main factors, social factors, that has then segregated women and men singing separate repertoires. the polyphonic skills required can be quite sophisticated. So it's also, again, this thing of thinking, you know, only very trained professional musicians can sing polyphony. Well, it's not the case. People who don't have any degree in music, who have never seen a music score in their lives, sing very complex polyphony, but and don't need to understand what it is to sing it. We're back to what also Niels and several of you mentioned about the type of implicit knowledge that is required. You do something, you don't need to explicitly understand what you're doing to be able to do it, like as we do with language. We don't learn grammar before we learn how to speak at least our native language, then it changes when we try to learn foreign languages. But and also it's a music in which there are clearly different groups, and maybe this is where, you know, particularly skilled singers can shine in the soloist role, and the rest of the group sings an easier voice. And there's also, of course, an entire social context involved every time. These are just examples of songs that I will maybe not listen, but at least you get to see the pictures of Georgia. Yes, some of the question I just put open to discussion is I wrote music as an extension of movement just because it's interesting how rhythm, for example, is often connected to the activity that you do while singing. So why do you have rhythm? Is because you're cutting something in the field at the same pace, or because you're walking, or because you're dancing, or people need to dance to your song. So this is something I find we often completely let go of, and we sing with our heads and not the rest of our bodies. And maybe we could teach counterpoint while dancing around, I don't know. Friendship and sound, I wrote this because one musicologist wrote that every time he asks why Georgian groups, what makes their sound so special, they invariably say it's because we are friends, because we trust each other, because we love singing together. And this, I think, many of us can relate to. Why, when is the best music made is when we make it with people whom we really trust, and especially improvisation. Improvisation, if you have an issue of ego and who's doing the best counterpoint, it's difficult to take risks. If you're in a very trusted atmosphere, then you can take all the risks in the world and enjoy it. So I think this is not an anecdotal thing. I think it's very important. Expertise in specific roles. This is interesting because as much as you become expert in a specific voice, when you know a Georgian song, you're supposed to know all the voices. So we have a little ensemble à Lilo in Basel that one of the co-founders here, that's why I'm looking there, but we took the time to memorize all the voices all together. It's important. It's not a matter of knowing any counterpointal thing, but it's important that you are able to replace any voice if they're missing. And sometimes there's also an issue of seniority. So if you meet another singer and you want to give them, you know, the honor of singing their voice of choice, and then you will sing a different voice. And this is especially true for repertoires in which there is more room for improvisation. In the West, in Guria, we will see in a moment, that singers will do this, you know, I will do this favor. The two famous singers will meet and they will be like, oh no, I'll let you be the upper voice and you can improvise all the want and I'll just take the other role. The importance of oral transmission, I think, is very relevant to also our practice. I'm just throwing the questions in there and we can discuss them. I don't have any answers, I just have questions. And the issues of performance context. Niels said, you know, that our revival of counterpoint is maybe limited to, I'm simplifying what he said, but it can be limited to schoolroom contexts. And well, I don't entirely agree, because we also have experience of, and several of you have mentioned also how pleasant it is and how enjoyable it is for both performers and the audience to introduce improvised counterpoints in concerts. This is a bit of more of a zoom on different musical dialects. So Svaneti is in the mountains. It's a very special texture. I don't think we have time to listen to something right now. Kaheti is the one you heard just before, the one that went into space, with this very long held notes in the bassos, and then the melismatic voices on top. Migrelni is also dissonant, it's a Western dialect, and Guria, the one I want to focus on, is a Western dialect, in which there's this particular a form of yodeling called kremanchuli, that and a lot of improvisation. It's called trio form because it's usually performed by 3 individuals. So as opposed to the other forms, the bassus is also just 1 person. I will try to. I can just go without. Yeah. Just a little comment you will hear in this song. It's a song about a deer hunt, and you will hear the barking of the dogs. We have also experienced singing this song and being very inventive with the barking of the dogs. Etc., etc. What's interesting in this music in Guria is they have a lot of nonsense syllables, and actually the nonsense syllable always often indicate a particular melodic movement, so they can serve as sort of building blocks. And so that's also where there's room for improvisation for the singers, and improvisation that by using a particular formula, you're giving an indication to your other singers where your melodic line is going to. So, for example, abadelo would be something going around. Na, ni, na will indicate a particular rhythmical pattern, or some other patterns will go up. It's interesting. I was not aware of this before reading about it, but it's true that in the repertoire that's what's happening. This is an interesting song because it talks about the Night in a Panther's Skin poem. So it has excerpts from the poem, and before and after each strophe, we have nonsense syllables. I will say more about this in a moment. Let's listen to this one. Sorry for the interruption again. You could hear also the nonsense syllables that give particular rhythm. So questions for us, I wrote down the role of text. The samrerisi are those nonsense syllables. Text in general is something also that indicates rhythm, but in this particular case of nonsense syllables, they are musical elements, telling the other singers what you're going to do. So there are about 60 words describing the different voices in Georgian polyphony, but basically they each have a different role. There are quotes that, for example, about improvisation of a singer who's saying the experienced singer could predict the final tone of each phrase section or the entire song, which each singer approached in his own way. So there is a modal framework, there is a frame, and then, as one of the singers said, you can do anything, but you don't go outside the frame. So you know where you're going to, you know what your finalis, so say, is. And you have a particular number of beats that correspond to particular phrases. So you know how much time you have to reach that cadence. And then you have formulas. So you know that the top, I don't know if you heard it in the song, but usually a cadence in Georgian singing is a unison. Sometimes a fifth, but most generally all the voices come together at the end of a phrase or at the end of a song. And so usually the top voice will approach by, I'm using tenor cadence, and the second voice will go from underneath with a soprano cadence, sort of a cantizans cadence, let's say, and the bassus will also come from underneath. But if a singer has decided to do differently and use a little formula, then the other one has to react and jump so that he takes the formula of the other voice. So you have, one musicologist did a whole PhD about the Gorian trio improvisation. It's called the Gorian trio improvisation memory and something else, I don't remember. He says there are different constraints with different degree of importance. That is maybe also relevant for our practices. The sonic content, what he talks about is the cadence. We know that we're going to this particular note, particular cadence. There's a procedural expectation about which voice should be taking which role, but this is less important. This can actually, we cannot change the final mode. If you change the final note, then you're changing the song. So this is something you cannot, a constraint that you cannot twist. The procedural expectation, the different roles of different voices, is something you can play around with. And then there's interpersonal hierarchy. So this is another quote by a singer who's saying that if you sing a song twice exactly the same way, that you really didn't sing a Gorian song. This is not how it works. So there's interpersonal hierarchy refers to this courtesy of, I'll let you choose which of the cadence you want and I will adjust to you. It works that way. Sometimes it also works that the experienced master will save a situation in which he sees the student doing something that their voice should not be doing, and he will just jump to correct and save the song. I don't think I have much time left, do I? Yeah, if you want to sing something, then maybe we should. This is just to say that there's not only this music, there's also, there's been a heavy influence of Western music on what they called city songs. So there's a whole repertoire, especially in Tbilisi, of city songs in which we have more Western harmonies. They have adapted this. I just put this because I found this funny. There's Mraval Jamier is like a table song which is a good health to everybody, and they have many Mraval Jamier. There's a Mraval Jamier from this region, Mraval Jamier from this singer, etc. And there's one Mraval Jamier Seduri, which is a Do major, a C major, Seduri. So they're just another version. They incorporate also. It's also interesting to see which of these repertoires have been promoted, especially in the times of the Soviet Union, and which not. And for example, the Gorian singing with the community, this has been very much marketed abroad as polyphonic Georgian singing, whereas the Gorian trio improvisation with its weird harmonies and the soloistic roles and very individual styles, this has not been marketed abroad because it was not as marketable and did not correspond to the ideology. likewise, now with a very strong nationalistic Georgia, they promote certain kinds of things. For example, they promote polyphony, and they completely forget there's also instrumental music in Georgia. Or it's interesting how the political atmosphere also shapes what is promoted, supported, and marketed. Yes, and these are questions, of course, for us. Again, this was also touched upon in one of the talks, and how does the market expect us to do improvised polyphony in concerts? I don't think so. But so it's a little messy, but I think we can. Your questions will maybe can help also shape this a little bit more. I think one of the main questions for me is this issue of professionalism. David mentioned in his talk yesterday of retaining and embracing an amateur approach to music, and I think it's something that's for us also to remember. We talked about pedagogic virtues of counterpoint. We talked about the sense of meraviglia yesterday, and also I wanted to talk about the sense of play again, because play is not only enjoyable as a hyper-modern individuals looking for sensory experiences, play is also the very fabric, the very motor of our learning. We learn by playing all the time. So I think one reason that we are also so drawn, at least I speak for myself, to these practices is how much of play it involves. But play is not something you can decide. Play is not something you can force. You cannot force someone to play. In other words, play has to be done willingly. So it's also a question for me in terms of pedagogy, how we retain this dimension of play in institutions which are not there to let people play. I think we have to go against some kind of institutional framework anyway if we want to put play as a central element of our music making. All the stuff about memory embodied knowledge has been said before, so I will not join that. But we can sing also. Just room to play. I also want to say, because this is maybe important, is also to have fun with variety of uses of singing. I think we improvise counterpoint we try to be good singers with beautiful voices, and I think we forget that we can have also a lot of fun in how we use our voices and experiment with that a little more. But this requires, again, an amateur approach to life, because the singers, it's not about how well you can sing, it's about how much fun you can have while you sing. I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much, and we can talk, have questions, and maybe learn a Georgian song. This is Didi Madloba. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. As I suggested, Caroline, that she could maybe, she's not doing a workshop this afternoon, and there is no space for more workshops, but we have a bit of time, as the break today is longer than yesterday, to do something a bit practically. Questions, if there are questions before that, if we keep them short, then we can maybe sing, learn some Georgian song from here.
I can also send it to you if you want.
Maybe it would be a suggestion. I heard that we could collect the presentations.
I did not read all of this for this. I had done my Spezialisierung on Georgian polyphony, so I didn't read all of this just for today. I wouldn't have that time. I recommend the thesis of, where is it? Brian Fairley. So this is just an article, but he also wrote a whole thesis about the Gorian song, which I think is very relevant to our questions. I didn't mention pedagogy explicitly, but of course it's always a question, again, how we, for example, how we transmit repertoire. What we did in Basel with Baptiste in improvisation class is first learn a lot of tunes by ear. That's the first step. Likewise, when I was asked to teach in Brussels introductory course to medieval music, they just wanted to, actually no, they asked me to teach an improvisation class in medieval music, because they wanted to have a more open. And I said, how can I teach improvisation in medieval music if the students have never heard medieval music before? So now it's called Introduction to Medieval Music, which is great because it's an umbrella allowing me to do what I want.
Other questions? Or could we sing something, Caroline?
Sorry, but so you said that in Basel you have a group where you learn all the voices, right? And so how did you did like a jazzman? You listen to the polyphony recordings and you do comment on dit, transcription of each voices.
Some of the songs I knew that had been taught, so then I just taught them to the other singers. Some other songs I listened to. And I taught myself the different voices by just listening. The only issue we have is that none of us speak Georgian. I don't speak Georgian. I sing Georgian, but I don't speak Georgian. So this is the issue we have, and this is the limitation of our ensemble: is that it's difficult. It's a difficult language, and we have struggled with that a little bit. But we have insisted on not giving scores or not. So the songs we know, we know. There was something yesterday or also about taking the time. I think in our very fast-paced world, we want to achieve results very quickly, but as we all know, we can browse through millions of pieces in repertoire and then just completely forget about them. And the songs that we have taken the time to learn and to know, that we know. And it's a slower route, but it's a more secure route. Chant sur le livre also makes sense when you know the repertoire. So, okay, as Niels said, what is applicable today, I don't know, because we don't know all these chants as people once used to, but maybe we can practice counterpoint on songs we do know, and tenors we do know, because we cannot have as much fun on things that we're just reading for the first time.
Thank you so very much. I went to 2 of your concerts in Basel, and it was just stunning. I have fond memories of that. And a movie that I watched 3 times, actually, 5 years ago when it came out, and Jan and I spoke about it yesterday, was And Then We Danced, about Georgian classical dancing, and a little coming-of-age story that won many prizes in Cannes. And my question is, because in the movie, the dancing is being portrayed as highly restricted, very patriarchic, and breaking souls in the educational system. And this feels like the opposite. This feels very free and liberating. So how is the relationship between the Georgian dance and the Georgian folk singing?
I'm not a specialist, so I wouldn't know too much about that, but this is maybe also my vision of improvisation and everything. Again, it's very segregated still, the singing today. And for example, all the famous Georgian polyphony ensembles, you will find only men. There are very, very few mixed ensembles, and there are some female ensembles, but they don't have as much success or as much exposure as the male ensemble. So it's still very much seen as a men's business. Again, this is a historical construction. There's no reason to think it has always been or must always remain that way. And the dancing is also very segregated. And it's the gendered thing is true of all dances, and it's up to the dancers everywhere in every tradition to try to do things differently and subvert those gender things if they wish to. I don't answer to the question because I really don't know about this. And the music for dance is only a small part and clearly what we have listened to now is not meant for dancing. But also you have some particular nonsense syllables for dancing that are more percussive. Like rim ti tairi 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 rim tairi aro, one of the songs we sang. This is really clearly for dancing. Would you like to sing something? Okay, but this is not improvisation, this is just something you can... Again, what is improvisation is also a very big question in every repertoire. The Gurian song has a lot of space for improvising melodic lines to go back to the structure. In other repertoires, you don't have the same freedom, but you have you always have some freedom. For example, it's always 3 voices, but the second voice can decide, or the first. So in other repertoires, let's say, the central voice is the main voice. The upper voice will be doing parallels, and the bassos will have a drone, as we have seen. And the upper voice can choose when they enter, for example. They don't, it would be stupid to enter every time. It's like, the alto voice in Renaissance counterpoint. Why would you enter at the same time as everybody else if you can leave it a little time, like you did in the concert 3 days ago? It's the same in Georgian polyphony. Also, again, anecdote is my role is always to be the second voice, because my sister has a higher voice, my dad has a lower voice, so I was always in the middle. And I knew how to do the second voice to a new song. I just knew how to do the second voice. And then I learned what it was, a guimel. But again, you don't need to know to be able to do it. Like also you were describing the experience with the Dursaina. It's just, we wouldn't even know how to describe, but you know how to do it. Okay, so we can learn, and maybe an easy song to learn is Mzeshina, I think. Arthur, you know it also. You wanna help me? It's been a little time. It's a song to welcome new babies into the world. So you know it's kind of my theme at the moment. So maybe we can sing that one. So the words we can just learn the first strophe is Mzeshina Damze Gareta. So Mze is the sun. The sun is inside and the sun is outside. Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodia. So the sun is inside, the sun is outside, the sun is inside the house. The sun being, the new life also. So Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodia. That's the text. And then should I just sing the middle voice? I don't know what a good range is, but. Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodia. So, Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodio. Dio, what am I saying? Dio, not Dia. Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodio. And then second phrase, Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshina Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodio. So the second phrase again. Second phrase, Mzeshin Damze Gareta, Mzeshin Shemodio. Mzeshin Damze Gareta, Mzeshin Shemodio. So the whole thing. Mzeshin Damze Gareta, Mzeshin Shemodio. Mzeshin Damze Gareta. Mzeshin Shemodio. That's easier. What am I doing? And the bassos, Mze, right? I'm looking at you. I didn't sing this song. Yeah, because it's a women's song. True, it's a women's song, but I'm a gender creative. I allow everybody to sing. So the bassos will be singing Mzeshin Damze Gareta, Mzeshin Shemodio, Mzeshin Damze Gareta, Mzeshin Shemodio. I shouldn't even have to show it. You will know when you need to change. So can we have two voices? You can choose your voice. Mze, mze. Mze, shinada, mze, gareta. Great, now we just add the third voice, doing parallel thirds above the middle voice. So it doesn't enter right away, so we go mze, shi, na, da, and then enters mze, gareta, mze, shin, she, mo, dio. Can you sing the middle voice and I'll sing the upper voice? That's right. So mze, mze, gareta, Ze, shin, she, mo, dio. Okay? Yeah? And then the second phrase. Ze, ze, shin, adam, ze, gareta, ze, shin, she, mo, dio. Should I repeat this upper voice again? You guys sing the two voices. I will show you the bassos, because I think you changed a little too soon. I'll show you. Ze, shin, adam, ze, gareta, ze, shin, she, mo, dio. Ze, shin, adam, ze, gareta, ze, shin, she, mo, dio. I heard a third. We cannot have a third in Georgian song. No, 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 no. Ze, shin, she, mo, dio. No, no, no. So we finish with the fifth this time. Can we do all three voices? You choose your voice. And once last time, just to have a little Georgian effect, because now it's very heavy to be all voices. Can you have a trio? Can two people just sing? And we do all the bassos, but two people can do the top voices. Who wants to be the trio?
No, very happy to let you do it. It's fine.
I can try.
Yeah. Which voice do you like? You do the upper voice?
Sure.
And you do the middle voice? Okay. Come
I'm very
close.
still reliant on your...
Yeah.
You said upper, so I can hear you.
Oh, yeah.
Come closer. And we support them. So actually you can start all on your own and just get us started. We need to give them the bassos. Let's start again. Mze. So you can. I'm just showing that you can ornament. You can. Ze garet, ze shinadam, ze garetam, ze shin shemodi. You just have to make sure you finish on the. Yeah, you just have to make sure you finish at the fifth. But in the meantime, you can do whatever millismas you want, because once more, last time. And we can enter either at the beginning or also wait for him to do his first phrase solo, kind of like a intonation, you know? Yeah. The mze ta da. Yeah, sorry. Mze mze. It starts on a fourth. Mze de de. That's our two notes. Sorry, I was not clear.
It goes down after we breathe, and on dio it goes up again.
See, again, the thing, I have no clue about intervals. Also interesting, again, how our different brains process counterpoint. I'm not a keyboard player. I have no idea about intervals. I just have the about melodic lines. I know where to start, and then we go all the way. Thank you very much. Bon appétit.
Thanks a lot. Before we go to the bon appetit, it would be nice if we could take a picture of
So we can all
all
gather
together.
on the steps and have a picture of the whole group.